Learning Pokemon is hard, which is why I'm here to teach you how to play. For reference, this video is going to be your crash course guide onto the beautiful world of competitive Pokemon. If you are newer to Pokemon in general, this should be very useful to you, so you aren't lost like I was. And if you're an experienced player, you can go over this and verify my information, but I'll make sure to correct your opinions in the comments like the worthless toxic trash I am. Now, so we can get this out of the way, so you guys know my qualifications, I've been studying competitive Pokemon for like almost a decade now. Back in high school, instead of working on tests and homework, I was on Smogon, battling the low tiers trying to work my way up the leaderboards for literally no reason. If there's anyone qualified to actually teach competitive Pokemon, well, it'd be the world champions, but they're all a bunch of lousy cheaters getting a hold of the metagame before literally everyone else, so it'd be me. If you're someone who struggles with learning type matchups, literally just have a matchup chart on standby. It's not cheating to have a resource to study from. However, Pokemon is pretty logical with its balancing. You know, if you set grass on fire, you'll start a forest fire. Super effective. If you pour water on rock and ground, the ground will turn into mud and the corrosion is a thing. Super effective. However, there's weird stuff like electric and steel. One resists the other and the other doesn't. Can you guess? If you said electric resists steel, you'd be right. And if you think it'd be wrong, well, if you chucked a chunk of fucking steel in the sky and it got hit by lightning, I don't think the chunk of steel is winning that exchange. And then we got fighting types are super effective against dark, which doesn't make sense because if you punch the darkness will consume you. And fighting is also super effective against rock and steel. And if you ever try to punch just wood, you know how much that'll hurt your hands. So imagine punching a goddamn fucking tank. In a sense, a lot of type matchups can be dictated by simple logic, but there's a lot of balancing decisions done so that nothing becomes imbalanced. I'm gonna make this very simple. IVs should always be maxed out, but don't stress if they aren't. They're mostly for hidden powers, but they also add a little extra power to each single stat, but ultimately don't matter. It only matters if the game itself was consistent, but pretty much everything is dictated by luck anyway, so doesn't really matter as much. And EVs, this is where things get complex, because a lot of how you build a Pokemon is mostly dictated by the meta surrounding them, or if the Pokemon is fairly one-dimensional. Take for instance, a beast of a Pokemon called Fortress. Fortress is a bug steel type that's physically bulky. It also learns stuff like Stealth Rock, Rapid Spin, and Gyro Ball, so it can be a hazard setter and remover while also dishing out tons of damage to frail offensive Pokemon. But because of the many outcomes you have, Fortress can have multiple EV builds. As a general rule for tanks, always buff your HP value. You might think it's best to ignore it and focus on both defenses, but adding more HP to your Pokemon can oftentimes make it more overall tanky than just straight buffs to the defenses. Of course, there are some exceptions and actual use cases for this type of thing, but generally speaking, always buff HP. And if you want to be optimal, put only 248 EVs into it. It'll end in an odd number, and it'll force the game to round up when taking in quote-unquote even amounts of damage, meaning you actually take one less damage than you usually would have. But of course, when you allocate 248 out of 512 EVs, you can only fully buff one more stat. So, which is it for our friend Fortress? Again, this can be dictated by the meta. Since fire-type moves are so common anyway, it's usually better to just buff HP and defense, since you have sturdy anyway, and you really need those hazards up. This can just be one of those Pokemon you send in to die rather than a tank. However, if there's less fire-type spamming, say water instead, it's actually better to buff your special defense, since your physical defense is so high anyway. But then take a Pokemon like Breloom. It is so frail and so slow that your only option is to buff attack and speed 100% of the time. Question at that point is if you want a speed increasing nature or an attack increasing one, but that's also dictated by the current meta. If your opponent is more likely to run tanks, there's no need to boost your speed as you'll already be faster than them. However, if there is a more faster paced meta, even if you're guaranteed to be slower, it's better to have that possibility of outspeed rather than no chances at all. If you want just a general rule while you're learning the meta, just buff whatever your Pokemon is lacking or whatever their main strengths are. As a basic reference, you want a team that can cover the most amount of type matchups while also being able to dish out enough damage to win. In most cases, you can follow the general rule of 2-2-1-1 teams. 2 attackers, 2 tanks, 1 setup, and 1 support. By having 2 attackers, you ensure you at least have guaranteed source of reliable damage. 2 tanks allow you to have central pivots that cover your team's weaknesses, and hopefully cover each other's as well. Having a setup Pokemon can allow you to go on those rampages where you sweep an entire team, or just general cleanup. If used correctly, these Pokemon can score anywhere from 2 to 6 KOs. And having a support on your team can help set up things like Reflect and Light Screen, provide healing with Wish, set up terrain like Sandstorm, or even have a good way to spread status effects like Paralysis. Of course, team structures can look however they need to in order to function. You can mix it up with 3 attackers, 1 tank, 2 supports, a team full of attackers called Hyper Offense, or even a team filled with tanks commonly known as Tanky Offense. The more you experiment, the better. There might even be some options you may not ever have thought of. Like say you like the Pokemon Crobat. You like its typing and you see it has Defog. So use it as a physical attacker with the option of Defog and its niche matchups. It absolutely shreds. However, you can absolutely make it a support by buffing HP and speed, give it Toxic and Venoshock, actively harming the opponent immensely while also being able to actively heal yourself with Roost and being a general pest. And with all of this team building going on, how do you actually know if a Pokemon has good stats to begin with? Especially if you base a lot of your decisions on Pokemon stats, you might seem confused to see base stats for the first time, and trust me, so was I. You could look at the base stat of 75, and then see later that when fully statted, it's actually 354. So what's going on here? General rule, if a Pokemon has a base stat of 80, it's competitively viable. And I mean for that one stat in particular. Not just in general, obviously. 80 is not exceptionally high or anything, it's just the threshold. 80 is good, 90 is great, 100 is high, and anything above 110 is beyond more than amazing. But great Pokemon can have low stats. Take Breloom as an example. Like we said earlier, it's very frail and pretty slow. So wouldn't it be bad? Sure, but it's also among one of the most meta-defining top tiers for years. Or about Fortress. It has 75 base HP. Is that bad? Well, 75 is actually pretty high for tanks. Most tanks are sitting around the base of 60 to 70, if not lower. Well, what about Blissey? It has a base HP stat of 255. Completely destroying every Pokemon in existence for best HP. Is that good? Well, yeah, but Blissey is borderline overpowered for a completely different reason. Sure, its HP stat helps, but it's more of a super special defense tank than anything else. And as anyone would know, most physical attackers can blow this thing off the field with a simple breeze. HP means nothing in this instance. So, how you know if a Pokemon is bad is if most of its stats are below 80. It has no realistic usage in any metagame anywhere. Unless you're fucking Smeargle. That is so good despite its stats, that had entire signature moves completely gutted simply because he exists. And he can't even learn certain moves anymore because this guy is the closest thing to Pokemon God than Arceus himself. Smeargle is so busted he had entire metagames built around him. If your team wasn't ready to deal with Smeargle's infinite possibilities, you were not winning that match. And you might think it's because he can learn near every single move in the game, so obviously Pokemon with the same trait are good, or just as broken as Smeargle, if not more so, and you'd be completely wrong. Don't get me wrong, Mew is really good, but I honestly wouldn't even consider banning this little guy in any competitive format. He's just so average that even low tier trash can easily destroy him. And don't even get me started with level 1 Pokemon strats in a format dominated by level 100 Pokemon. Because, oh boy, we have some cheese floating around. And lastly, we have items. If you team build with Smogon, it actually gives you a list of viable and mostly used items, because those are pretty much the only items worth running in the first place. If you want to run an off-meta item, you basically learn some niche cases of berries and see what they can do, but in most cases not a ton of items are available to you anyway. There are some items not listed in some formats like Flame Orb or Black Sludge, but like I said, niche items for niche strategies. Or in the case of Black Sludge, literally just leftovers, but for poison types only, which end up becoming pretty fucking niche. And that just about does it. I feel like I could go over a lot more in this video, but honestly, this is really all you need to get started. Just knowing these few things will really help jumpstart your knowledge, and I hope these helped, and I would really like to give a special thanks to my Patreon sponsors, Fancy, for helping make videos like this possible. I almost said another scripting error that I wrote because I didn't fucking catch it, and it's called fucking Makel. Oh god. I'll see you all guys later.